away. Is that right? Yep, 1 minute away from 8 o'clock. And as you will notice, I am not Julie. Julie had some family stuff come up, and so I will be taking her place only by standing in here. I am not as good as Julie at running these things. So you'll just have to bear with me. But yes, thank you for putting in here in the chat where you're from. We appreciate that a lot. It's just fun to see where everybody is. And I will let you know, I'm actually in Washington County, Pennsylvania. I'm visiting the chapter. We had our gathering last night and it was fabulous. And then tonight I am here at the president's house and we all had dinner together, lots of laughter, which is great for our liver. And we saw her urban homestead, which is amazing, truly amazing. So it's been a great trip so far, and they've got all kinds of other things planned for me in the next 2 days. So yes, if everyone will go ahead and finish putting where they are from in the chat, we appreciate that. I'm not going to take up a ton of time tonight. Oh yeah, Sheila, I missed you. Sorry. Because I can't wait to hear about composting for this evening. So I just want to do a couple of reminders about a couple of things with the National Ladies Homestead Gathering. First of all, if you have a question or you have a suggestion maybe for a speaker or anything regarding our National Virtual Gathering, the email address for that is media@nlhg.org. And as always, Miranda is behind the scenes. See how fast she is doing all the tech stuff. That is not my forte whatsoever. So I'm very grateful that Miranda's here to do all that stuff. The other thing too, that I really encourage you to be a part of, if you are not, is our online forum. So we actually pay for this platform as a safe place for you all to talk about homesteading. You can say the word heifer, and nobody's going to tell you that you're a bully because you are using the word heifer, because we all know why you're calling a female cow a heifer. And you can ask any questions you want to. There's no censorship, and it is a great place to get information. Plus, we have women in our forum that are from all over the country. So if you have a specific question, I've seen some others that are like, I'm moving to such and such a place. If you're moving to a certain area and you want to know about things, especially homesteading, go ahead and ask that, because I'm sure we have somebody from that area that will be on there. So the place to go to for that is community.nlhg.org. Look, she's faster than me. Thank you, Miranda, for putting that up here in the chat. Also with that, you will be asked a couple of questions, and that's just so that we know who's coming on. And so don't be worried about the questions. One of them is, are you a woman? Yes. And then they will get you into the forum. Our website, and that has a bunch of information. That's also another way that you can get to the forum. I typically send people there. On the main page, there's places that you can look to on there, and it will say, you know, join our online forum, and you can click that and it will also take you there. So the website is nlhg.org. And then the last thing, and Amanda's going to beat me to, or Miranda's going to beat me to it because she knows what I'm going to say next. Our May National Virtual Gathering registration link, so you can put it up here, and then we'll have it up at the very end. And then that's to sign up for next month's virtual gathering. So, oh, we also have a YouTube. The YouTube I highly recommend. All of our virtual gatherings are on there. Then we've also had other classes. There's the link for the May virtual gathering. But on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube@nlhg.org. There are all kinds of, there's classes that are on, there's education things that are on there. I highly recommend that you go over to our YouTube, because there's a lot more information on there about homesteading than I think a lot of our women know about. So, and then of course, like and subscribe, because that always helps us out. All right, I made it through all my announcements that I had to do. And then the next thing, hold on. Oh, purpose statement. Our purpose statement is, empowering women through homesteading. So we really appreciate you being on here. This is one of the ways that we empower our women is by sharing knowledge. And with sharing the knowledge, we also build our community. And through those communities, we grow friendships. So that is our mission statement, to share knowledge, build community, and grow friendships. And our National Virtual Gathering is all part of that. And so these women who don't have a chapter, or those that do have a chapter, we come together virtually. And then if you're not involved in a chapter, we highly recommend that you look to see if there's one in your area and get connected, because the most incredible community is the one that's face to face. All right. The next thing is our Atta Girls. These are one of my very favorites because, as we say, if you've planted your first tomato or you've overhauled your tractor, we want to hear about it and we want to celebrate you. So our illustrious June is going to get on and share a couple of our Atta Girls with us.
Good evening. I am just sharing some of the Atta Girls from our online community forum. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, just double checking. Perfect. Okay, you all have been so busy. Each month we post in the community forum and asking you to share your Atta Girl moments. Those can be successes. Those can be maybe you tried something new and it was not a huge success. It was a bit of a flop. We want to hear about it. We love that, learning and being inspired from all of you. So some of the things that were shared this month, Debbie dehydrated celery and apples and hash brown potatoes. She got her sourdough starter going, made pancakes with the discard, and finished up knitting socks. Carla planted seeds for lots of vegetables, going to get topsoil for raised beds, have fruit plants and things to plant when ready, and so many new lemon balm plants coming up in a pot she planted in. Kelly attended a workshop in the Sullivan County, Tennessee chapter with the husband and successfully learned how to maintain a sourdough bread starter and bake beautiful bread step by step. And that there are some beautiful pictures of her bread there. I love to see the pictures too. Mandy built a cold frame, and that is so neat. A little greenhouse type of thing. Amy has her first flock of heritage chocolate turkeys. One tom and 4 hens are doing well. One hen, she believes, is sitting on a nest, and another is laying in another nest. They free roam, and she hasn't found the nest yet, but she will. They're such beautiful birds. Stephanie tried some winter sowing and planted tomatoes, beans, peas, cucumbers, corn, and artichokes. She also upcycled this amazing cabinet with looks like a cost of $7. There's a picture of that. You ladies have been so busy, and thank you for sharing all of these Atta Girl moments, and we look forward to seeing more.
Thank you very much, June. Appreciate it. And a big Atta Girl to all of you. That we know there's a whole lot more on that list, but we don't have time to read them all, but we can celebrate you all right now. So big Atta Girl to all of you for all the things that you've accomplished in this last month. The other thing that I wanted to do before I introduce our speaker for tonight is a shout out to Stephanie Baumgartner. And I also want to put out to the rest of you, if you go onto our website and you look under events, it actually lists out who our speakers are, or not who our speakers are, what our topics are for the rest of the year. Now, we were struggling a little bit to get a teacher for tonight for composting, and Stephanie Baumgartner found out, and she has been taught by Julie, our speaker for this evening, and she recommended her. So any of you, if you go onto our list and there's a teacher that you know of that like is so good, please send that name and the topic that they're great about teaching to our media@nlhg.org. Your help helps us tremendously because you're a much bigger audience and you touch a lot more people and you learn from a lot more people. So helping us fill in those spots is great. And also, thank you, Miranda, for putting that up there. If you have topics that you want to learn about, oh, and you just happen to have a teacher who's really good at teaching that particular topic, please send in those suggestions and the name of the teacher. We appreciate that, and it helps Julie out a lot in getting these set up for our year. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. I'm actually super excited, and I'm sorry I didn't memorize the bio for her, so I'm going to read it just so you have an understanding of who this amazing woman is. She is a pedagogical director and garden teacher at the Sandpoint Waldorf School in Sandpoint, Idaho. She loves to garden and cook, two activities which relate to one another, as the children discover when they work with her. She runs a summer camp at their school where they cook lunches from the garden harvest. She has been gardening and making compost for over 30 years, and she's still learning, which I love to hear. I feel like anything homesteading, it's a never-ending learning. She loves working with children. Gardening constantly brings surprises, challenges, and new discoveries. She does not consider herself an expert, just an enthusiast, which we love. She's a member of her local biodynamic gardening group, and they gather together to make biodynamic compost preparations and to deepen their understanding of biodynamic gardening principles and practices. And so she's super excited to share with us tonight, and we are super excited to actually hear her presentation and to glean all this wise information that she has. So Julie, thank you for being on here with us tonight, and we appreciate you, and thank you for coming to share your knowledge with us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julie McCallan, and just as that wonderful introduction, and I was glad to hear more about your organization. The love of gardening didn't start as a child. I didn't have a garden as a child, grew up in Phoenix in New Mexico, and it was rather dry. But I went off to college and came home in the summer and said, we're starting a garden. And starting a garden meant starting compost. And my first pile of compost was just taking the kitchen scraps and the gardening scraps and putting them in a pile, kind of in a three-sided chicken wire plate, little bin to put them in. And then when it sat for over a year and I pulled aside the top stuff, then there were some worms in some soily looking stuff at the bottom. And I thought, there's my compost. Well, shortly after that, I went off to the Peace Corps in Ecuador, and I met a fellow volunteer who ended up becoming my husband. And he was very much the garden expert and had studied John Jeevan's French intensive biodynamic gardening methods. And he taught me a lot more about gardening and a lot more about composting. And together we began studying more about biodynamic agriculture. And the magic he could work in the garden, I've never quite achieved, but at least I achieved the magic of making compost, which I will share some of with you tonight. When I work with the children, I talk about how gardening is like baking a cake. And they kind of marvel at that at first. And I said, well, in gardening, when I was talking to you about what we need in gardening, we learned about the four elements: warmth, water, air, and earth. And that's also parts of making compost. It's parts of baking a cake. And so I have them think about, well, what's the analogy there? And they look at well, they can go, okay, well, you need some kind of moisture in the cake, so that could be the water. And you need something dry and earthy, maybe that's the flour. But I go, so what's the warmth? And they go, well, sunshine. Well, that's not, the oven is the warmth in baking a cake, but the sunshine isn't going to be the warmth we need in the compost pile. What we're going to need is something else. And so I have them think about it. And there's usually someone who is pretty sharp and might come up with the answer right away. And if they haven't come up with the answer right away, I remind them that the week before we were going to make our compost pile, we went off to a farm and we went to visit some animals. We visited a donkey and some sheep, and we gathered their manure and brought it back. And so then from that, they'll make the connection easily that, oh, we are going to be making compost with the manure, and the manure is going to supply the heat. And so like when baking, we're going to make layers of what we're going to be working with. And so, yes, here's the balance of the 4 elements. The fire is going to be the manure or green material, like grass clippings will also heat up a pile. Needs water, not too wet and not too dry. Both will kind of stop the composting action. And it needs what would be called the earthy material, the dry plant material, straw, dried leaves, and just a bit of soil. And then the air is the space between the material. And that's a very important part of the compost pile as well. You don't want it to get too compressed. Next slide, please. So the compost means to bring things together, from the Latin word composites, which is to place together. And the basic sources of the compost are going to be what we call our browns and our greens, and it's a balance of both. The browns include corn stalks. I haven't found corn cobs decompose very fast, though they may take a couple of years. Dry leaves, some people will use newsprint. I personally don't like to put anything that has ink on it in the compost pile, just because I feel like it's introducing another element into the pile, but you can use newsprint. Pine needles, straw and hay. Sawdust you have to use very sparingly. Sawdust and wood chips take a lot of nitrogen to break down. So you don't, if you're just putting a little bit in, it'll be fine. If your animal manure is mostly got lots of sawdust in it, you will probably need another source of animal manure that isn't so mixed with sawdust. And then shrub trimmings will work, and crushed eggshells. So those all count as the carbon sources. Then there are the nitrogen sources, which provide the heat for the pile. The coffee grounds, tea leaves. You can use fish waste only in a larger pile. I wouldn't use it in what we'll talk about as the passive pile, because it can get smelly and it could draw in mice or other critters that you don't want in your pile. But if you have a great big large pile and lots of manure that you're working with, you could certainly put in fish waste as well. Fruit and vegetable scraps, grass clippings, and then fresh hay, animal manure, and seaweed are all excellent sources for nitrogen. The items not to compost, and this is one of the reasons I love having backyard chickens, is because I can give them some of these items and let them eat them up and then make the manure for my compost pile. You don't want bones, you don't want anything fatty, so no cooking oil or lard, no meat products, no nut butters, and of course, nothing chemically like cleaning solvents, petroleum products, synthetic fibers, because they will not break down. They may even kill the microbial action that is going to be making your compost transform. No cheese, dairy products, mayonnaise, milk, salad dressing, no pet feces or plastic. So those are all things not to put in your compost. A reason for composting, when you look at this list, is of course to transform waste into something else, something good for your garden. It also, when you mix these materials and you actually create the compost and put it in your garden, it improves soil health and it improves the tilth or structure of your soil. It can actually over time transform the nature of your soil. If you have a very sandy soil, adding all that organic matter from your compost will gradually transform that sandy soil into something that'll hold water and have more structure to it, so it clings together more. Conversely, if you have very heavy clay soil, adding that compost over the years and all that organic matter will start to lighten that soil and not make it so heavy and dense. Another reason to have the soil is it helps you to, I mean, not the soil, the use of compost is because it helps you to avoid the use of chemicals, chemical fertilizers, even chemical pesticides can be avoided often with the use of your own homemade compost. And one of the things that I love most about the making compost is it makes me a part of the cycles of life, and sharing that with children too, is taking what's decomposing and is dying and transforming it into something that's alive, something that's going to help bring life to your garden and help grow plants again. So that wonderful picture of transformation that we see both in gardening and in cooking, for that matter. And that's part of the joy that I have in it and the joy that children have in it. I see a question about, what about your own waste? I would not put human feces into a compost pile at all. That takes a very special kind of composting process that I know that some city municipalities have the ability through their sewer treatment plants to treat that, but of course in human beings not. You can use urine. Urine is actually sterile, and it adds a lot of nitrogen to a compost pile. So in the when I lived out in the country, not since I've lived in the city, we did sometimes put urine into the compost pile, because of the uric acid is very strong and high in nitrogen. So good question there. Next slide, please. So there are two basic forms of composting. One is the cool passive compost, which is what I started with when I first started gardening. And that's where you're just collecting your waste, your kitchen waste, your eggshells, your garden waste, those trimmings from, or the plants, the weeds you've pulled out, although be careful with the weed seeds in your compost pile. All of that you're just collecting over time. And you can have it in a bin, you can just have it on a mound on the ground. It doesn't need to be a special receptacle. I mean, you can buy composting receptacles. I find the best compost is always with the compost sitting on the ground, so that the worms can enter in, all of the microbial beings that are in your soil can help be part of the compost pile by sitting on soil. So I have never been a fan of compost turners that you can see that are above ground, a drum that you can spin, because it's not getting the soil in it and it's very hard to keep it moist. This kind of compost pile takes patience. It doesn't take much work. It's just sitting there. It's going to take over a year for the stuff on the bottom to start to really decompose, to really have decomposed into what will look like humus, will look like soil matter you can take. But you have to take all this other stuff off the top. So this is where it's useful to have a second bin nearby where you can turn all the recent stuff into that pile to get to access the good stuff at the bottom, which you can then put on your garden. It doesn't heat up a lot. It is the microorganisms that can live in this kind of compost pile are called mesophiles. For anyone who has made cheese, you'll know that you can have a mesophilic starter or a thermophilic starter, and those are the same kind of organisms. The mesophilic organisms don't like a lot of heat. In fact, they really don't survive in temperatures much above 100 degrees. So that's in cheese making, those are your soft cheeses that you're going to use mesophilic starter. In a compost pile, those are the kind of organisms that'll grow naturally to help digest your food. You don't need to add a starter to get them. But a high heat, like if you were to add lots of manure into the pile, those little creatures wouldn't be able to survive in a compost pile that is hot. So in your cool pile, those mesophilic organisms are going to work slowly, and it takes a while. It could take over a year to break down the material, but eventually you will get some composting. You do have to keep the pile wet. I know from growing up in the desert that a dry pile will not do much at all. It'll sit there for a long time, as anyone who's been in the desert and found a dried up orange peel or something like that can attest to, that they don't decompose very quickly. Or even as you see in the ancient Indian cliff dwellings in the Southwest, they still have their dry corn cobs there because they don't break down in something that's dry. There is, if you want, and I'll show you a slide of that later, that you can have several bins. So as one fills up, you can have another bin that you start to fill up. Next slide, please. The other kind of compost making is the reverse of cool and passive is warm and active. And as you can see from this picture, it can get quite warm. On a cool, frosty morning, you can actually see a warm pile steaming, and you can feel a little bit of the heat radiating off of it. This is different. This isn't one that you keep adding up to. This one, you've gathered your materials for the pile over time, and then you build the pile. And this is the kind of compost that I make now. And I gather my garden scraps, my kitchen scraps, all in a pile over the course of a year. I happen to keep chickens, so my chickens are going to get all the things that you can't put into a compost pile. They're also going to get most of the cooked food I give to them directly, and so that they can turn it into wonderful manure for me. This is going to be using the thermophilic bacteria, because the temperatures are going to get up to 130 to 170 degrees in the pile. And this is what the children absolutely love. When I make a compost pile with them, and then we go out the next day or 2 days later, and I dig a hole for them to put their hand in, and the brave ones at first are going, "Oh, okay, I'll do it." And they stick their hands in. And then when they squeal with delight at how warm it is, and even jerk their hand out because it can be too warm, then the others want to try it as well. And of course, washing their hands afterwards. So it really does heat up inside. And this is what will help kill the weed seeds. And it can sometimes help kill the eggs of harmful insects. So it's a pile that's going to be more beneficial for your garden in the long run, in that it may not be spreading the weed seeds. The temperature will decrease as it goes along, and I see a question for goat manure. You can use any of the animal manures, not of course your dog and cat feces, but the chicken manure is what I use, but goat manure is great, sheep manure, rabbit manure. If your family keeps guinea pigs or any of that kind of manure can go in. Cow manure and horse manure are also wonderful for the pile. And some people use pig manure as well in the compost pile. I have heard from those who do keep pigs that you want a balance of not just pig manure in a pile, but to try to mix it with other animal manures as well as the plant waste. So when I make the pile, I start with, after I've gathered all my things, I start with a brushy layer at the bottom. That's going to be corn stalks, sunflower seed stalks, those kind of things, even the thick stalks of kale and cabbage. Those are going to go at the bottom, and I try to chop them up as much as possible so that they're not too thick. But those are the things that are going to help create air at the bottom of the pile, and they are also the things that are going to take a little longer to compost. So they're at the bottom of the pile, and then I will put a layer of the manure, and I'm going to water it in. After every layer, I put more water in. When you're dealing with manures in a pile, it's going to heat up quickly, and that can dry out a pile. So you have to make sure that it's very well moistened to begin with, and that you keep it moist. If you don't have manures, you can also use green manure. You can use green grass clippings. Anyone who's dumped a pile of grass clippings know that they can heat up, and they can get very stinky too. And that's part of that heating process. So if you are using grass clippings, if you're putting them into the pile, then it's the dry matter that will help keep them from getting slimy and stinky, because you're mixing them all. So on top of the manure, then I always sprinkle a little bit of very thin layer, just a kind of scattering of a little bit of lime and some of my eggshells. And that's particularly true for my chicken manure, because chicken manure heats up very fast, and the lime will help, and the lime in the eggshell will help to turn down that heat just a little bit so it doesn't heat up too fast. If you've seen a pile that heats up too fast, you'll see it almost looks like mold, but it's not. It's a white grayish substance in it, almost an ashy stuff in it, because it heated up so quickly. So the little tiny sprinkling of lime and eggshells helps to cool it down just a little bit. It also helps here in North Idaho, where we have boreal forests, and our soil tends to be acidic, the lime helps sweeten the soil, as they call it, to take down the pH of the acidity just a little bit. You can turn a pile, and it is recommended to turn it at least once, because then it starts to mix it, but that's after it has sat for at least 2 weeks to a month. So as I said, I'm layering these layers of manure, and then my dry matter, which will be the straw, the dried leaves, the dead plants I pulled from the garden. And I just keep layering that until I've got a nice pile. It should be at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet to have the density to hold in the heat and to really work well. You can make them much larger, as you can see from this pile. Next slide, please. And here's a much smaller pile. My pile in my home garden will look more like this. The one at the school, which is a bigger pile, will be larger, like the past slide. When it's all created, I like to cover my piles with a layer of leaves or straw and a little bit of soil, just to kind of give it a skin, to give it a sense that it's complete now and finished, and it's going to sit there for a while. All of that will get turned into it again when I turn the pile in about a month. I don't always turn my piles. I get busy. The one at the school, it starts to get cold after we build it, because we usually build the pile in late September or October. And we sometimes don't get out to turn it again. And that's fine. It still composts. It's just that turning it once or twice does speed up the compost making. I like to let my piles sit for a year. And once you've started in the composting practice, then you'll always have a pile that's ready to go into your garden, and you'll have a pile that's, quote, cooking and coming into its composted nature. And so you'll never be without. It's those first years that you have to be patient while it finishes the composting process. If you turn it, it does hasten it, and you might be able to use it within 6 to 9 months, depending on what climate you are in. Next slide, please. So the next part of composting, there's the active and the passive form, and then there's the biodynamic compost. And that's really just taking it a step further. Biodynamics is a form of agriculture and gardening that was created by Rudolf Steiner, who is also the person who created Waldorf education. He was an Austrian philosopher and scientist who worked in many levels. Even there's in architecture, in medicine, there's many places in which he added his wisdom. In terms of gardening and Waldorf education, you can see the similarities in both, in that they are very much a holistic approach, one to education, one to gardening, and both really acknowledge the spirit as part of nature, the spirit that's part of every human being, and honoring that in the practices that are used. For in biodynamic compost preparations, they're made in a special way, and you can buy them from the Josephine Porter Institute, which I include a link in at the end. You can also make them. We have a local group here in Sandpoint that makes the preparations every few years, and it's a process of harvesting the flowers of yarrow, chamomile, and dandelion, of scraping a little bit of oak bark, and harvesting the nettles. And then the last one is valerian, which you get from squeezing the juice out of the valerian flowers. All of them have a very specific way that they're fermented. Obviously, you can see from the photo that they don't look anything like their original state, because they all sat for a year in the soil in some sort of animal sheath as part of the way that it works for creating the preparations. And that's a whole other picture that I could share at another time of how we actually make the preparations. All of them go into the compost pile when you've finished it, and before you add that last layer of leaves or soil or straw, then you're going to make 6 holes in the compost pile. And they're deeper holes. Like, I take the end of my shovel and kind of work it in through all the fibers, so that when I put 1 little teaspoon of each of these, each goes into its own hole. So in one hole, I'll put a teaspoon of the yarrow preparation, in another hole, a teaspoon of the chamomile, etc. The valerian actually goes on in a different way because it's a liquid. You put a couple drops of it into a gallon of water in a container that's a 5-gallon bucket will do, a ceramic crock will do, and you're going to stir it you're going to stir it until you make a vortex, and then you stop and you go the other direction and make a vortex the other way. And you keep doing this for 10 to 15 minutes, which thoroughly mixes in the valerian into the water, and the forces get dispelled into the water. For anyone who knows homeopathy, the preparations are very much like homeopathy. They're working with a tiny, minute amount of something that can use that its forces can be used in the entity it's going into. So in the compost pile, a little bit of these forces go into the pile. And they each have something that they're specifically working with in the pile. So for instance, yarrow has a relation to sulfur and helps regulate the potassium process in the pile. Chamomile has a relationship to calcium and helps regulate that in the compost pile. Stinging nettle, which also works with both iron and then helps regulate sulfur, potassium, and calcium. Oak bark helps prevent plant diseases and works with calcium. And the dandelion helps assimilate silicic acid. And that is something you don't hear much of when we talk about what are the nutrients that plants need. But silicic acid is actually needed by plants. And it's the dandelion preparation that helps that become assimilated into your compost. And then valerian works with the phosphorus process. And it's actually has a warming attribute to it. Valerian is also a preparation that biodynamic farmers will use. They'll mix it up in that same sort of way, and they can mist it on plants before a light frost is threatened. And it can help with light frost, not heavy frost. It can help prevent frost damage to those plants. So it does have a warming process to it that also works with that compost pile, helping to regulate the heat of the pile. So these are put on in each of their holes. The valerian is stirred, and then it is poured into a little mister or a spray pack, and it's sprayed over the pile, half of it, and the other half is poured into the last remaining hole in the pile. And all of these are then, the soil is tamped back onto them, or the compost is tamped back onto them, and they're left to do their work. If you turn a pile, you want to add the preparations once again. Preparations work with bringing order and chaos. You can see it in the stirring. When you stir into a vortex and you switch the other way, then you get this kind of wave action and a splash, and there's that bit of chaos, and then you're bringing order into it again. So biodynamic agriculture works very much with that sense of working with the chaos of creation and bringing order to it. And that's why after a pile has been turned, you have that chaos happened, you want to add the preps back in. So they're working again with the forces that happened there. A few other things that biodynamics works with, if you're interested in pursuing it further, is biodynamics works very much with also what's going on cosmically. What are the moon cycles? Very much returning in a sense to what is the ancients used in their gardening and farming wisdom of when do you plant in the phases of the moon. For instance, planting your seeds before a full moon works for most things, but carrots actually work better if planted during a new moon because they are going to take so long to germinate. They can take up to 2 weeks to start to germinate. Those kind of ancient wisdom techniques are also brought into biodynamics, and yet in a sense with the scientific knowledge of why things work that way. There's also working not only with the moon cycles, but for those who've studied it enough to also work with the constellations, what constellation are the sun and the moon in, what forces may be coming down cosmically to the earth at those times. That's another part of biodynamics. A third part is really thinking of a farm or even just your household garden in a town of being an organism. It's its own entity, and you want to keep that entity as healthy as possible. Hence, the compost preparations help to do that, making your own compost, ideally from all the things from your own land, so that you've got this self-sufficiency to your farm or garden entity. And really thinking of that as a sense of a being that you're wanting to nurture, and really looking at it as, well, what is it telling me? What insects are coming? What diseases are on my plants? What's out of balance that this is happening? And what do I do to bring balance to it? Those are questions we all ask as gardeners anyway, and working with that in a deeper way with biodynamics. Next slide, please. What are the containers for your compost? As I said, I just make mine directly on the ground, and I make my compost heap once a year once I've cleaned out my chicken house. But there's also ways to store it. This is the kind of compost bins we have at school. It's nice because you can layer in, you can put those boards on the front side as you fill it up, and then you can remove them as you want to shovel out of the compost bin. A 3-set system is handy, especially if you're doing the passive form of composting. You can fill one up and let it sit for a year, while the next year you build another one, and then you aren't still adding waste onto the pile that you're trying to go, okay, this is going to be finished soon, I just want to let it sit so that when it's done, I can just shovel it out. Or you can have your pile that you just have the one pile that's growing, because you don't have that much waste. Then you're going to shovel off your top layer into the next bin to get to that layer that has composted down underneath. If you do active composting, like I do now, where you're just going to build a compost pile when you have enough material gathered, this is the place you can store your material. So that it's there when you want it. You could even divide it into the dry material and the green material. I always like to have some straw on hand or leaves to scatter over any of the fresh stuff I've just put into a compost pile, so that it can cut down on the smell of it. If I just put something smelly in the pile, it'll help dampen that smell down. It is fine to have a compost pile in the shade. It will keep it from drying out so much. If you live in a very wet climate, I know some people will cover their compost pile during the wet season because they don't want it to get too soggy and wet. I've never done that because I like to think of it being out in the into the air, and haven't noticed that my pile has gotten too wet. But if you really are in a very wet place, you could build a small roof over your compost pile, like a shed roof, to protect it from too much rain. But the biggest thing is not to let it dry out, because a dry compost will not compost as well. Next slide. Just some quotes to leave you with, because I find them inspirational. The one is by Bernard Leeuwenhoek, who is a Dutch philosopher, Dutch psychologist. He wrote, "The compost heap is like a caterpillar in a chrysalis state. It's the same chaos. As the butterfly comes to manifestation out of the chrysalis, so the plant out of the compost, excuse me." And then another quote by Wendell Berry: "To live, we must daily break the body and spill the blood of creation. When we do this knowingly, lovingly, skillfully, reverently, it is a sacrament. When we do it ignorantly, greedily, clumsily, destructively, it is a desecration." And I think for all of us who are doing these homesteading tasks, we all love that sense of, how do we work with nature to create bounty for our families? And so we know that sense of reverence for what we can do with our skills and what we can do with nature to transform our lives and the lives of those people around us. There was a question, am I keeping the piles wet as I collect the stuff? That's a great question. I don't try to keep my piles wet as I'm collecting it if I'm going to make an active one pile at the end of the growing season, because it'll all get wet when I mix it up. I've got a hose there as I build it up, and I don't need it to really start that active decomposition. I want to save that until I build my pile. That being said, I don't mind if the rain gets on it. I'm just not watering my materials as I'm collecting them. I do have a page here in the next slide that has some resources for you. So these are just websites that have more information on them. Two of them are just regular compost making sites that for ideas for how to make your compost at home, talking a little bit more about the passive and active types of composting. And then if you are interested in finding out more about biodynamic preparations, the third one down is from the Josephine Porter Institute, where you can order the biodynamic preparations. The next one is about a little bit more information about biodynamic compost preparations. And if you're interested in, the last one is ordering a planting calendar, which is put out by the Biodynamic Association, which when we stop sharing the screen, I'll show you my most current one, which I delight in because it has articles in it that for each month that gives you a lot of information about reading or about gardening that you can read. And then it gives you a sense of what phases the moon is in. So this is the calendar. It's called Stella Natura, and it is a wealth of information for anyone who wants to order them. It gives, and if you can see here, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see that this is the calendar. It's got, you can see the darker spots. It'll black out areas where it feels like, oh, this isn't a time during an eclipse. You're not going to be planting because you don't have the forces of the sun and moon aren't as strong during an eclipse, those kind of things. So if you're interested in delving a little deeper, this goes into a lot more information than I can. I don't use all of it. I use what I can of it. And of course, for those who really want to study further, then there's on the biodynamic website, there are books and resources and courses that you can get involved in. I'm happy to answer if there's any more questions, but that's my presentation on the joys of composting, and I hope it inspires you to start compost piles as well.
Julie, this has been amazing, and thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions on here. One of the gals asked, she said, one slide said the warm active pile is ready in 6 to 8 weeks, and another slide said ready in 6 to 9 months if you turn it.
Oh, thank you. I can clarify that. It should have said 6 to 8 months. If you're turning it, it can be ready. If you don't turn that active pile, I let mine sit a year before I use it, just to make sure it's all decomposed and there's nothing that's going to still be too raw for the garden bed.
Okay, perfect. And then another person asked, can you use dried out manure from old barns?
Oh, yes. Just moisten it and it should usually heat back up again if it hasn't been fully composted. If it has been fully composted, then it won't heat up and it's ready to go directly on your garden.
Okay. Thank you. And then another gal asked, is it okay to put these ingredients directly into a raised bed with worms added? I'm not sure what ingredients she's talking about.
So you'll want all of this to compost before you put it into your bed. If you took all these ingredients and just stuck them on a garden bed, you would have, it would take a while to it would still need to compost, so you couldn't be growing in it because those forces that are going into breaking down the compost aren't there for growing your plants. So I don't think you could incorporate that directly into your soil. I know there are techniques of gardening where you put like the lasagna type of gardening where you're not ever really incorporating new material. You're laying stuff on top and not digging it in. But that wouldn't be putting green, fresh manure on. It would be too hot for your plants. That's letting the dried leaves decompose on your garden and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that answered the questions, but that's how I interpret it.
It sounds like a great answer, so I'm going to say yes, you did. Someone said, so we put raw vegetables and raw eggshells in the mix in compost, or should we? It ended with a question mark, so I'm not sure if it was a statement or a question.
You can put all of that stuff into the compost, the eggshells, any of the fruits and vegetables, almost anything from your kitchen that isn't heavy in oils. Those are the things. That's why, as I said, I like to have my chickens so I can toss them the leftover macaroni and cheese or something, and they'll eat it up, because I'm not going to put that in my compost pile because it's too
Mm.
fatty.
Okay. And then this other question, which I thought, oh, I need this question. If we're buying compost for places that sell it in bulk, because we aren't set up for it yet, what are some good questions to ask those that sell it?
Oh, great question. I've never
Yeah.
bought compost, but I would want to know what, if they can give you what the process was and what was in the compost, because I have heard that there are sometimes things from chemical processes that get put in compost that you might not want in there. For instance, byproducts of making something that, so I would just check and ask them for their ingredients and how it was made. Because yeah,
Okay.
if you can't make the compost, you need compost from somewhere. I find what some of my friends who are gardeners who don't have much of an active compost pile, they will see if they can buy aged manure from a farmer or something like that to put on their beds, so that doesn't have to be composted. And that's usually a good source of new material for your garden beds.
Okay. And then another person, we do have several questions. There's some here in the chat and then some in the Q&A. What about using biochar in your compost?
I'm not sure what that is. So someone can, what is it?
I don't know what biochar is.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that one.
Okay. Whoever, I can't remember who asked that question.
Oh, can charcoal be added to the compost pile? I see that one. You can add a little bit of ash or charcoal to the compost pile, but not much. It's a lot of carbon to the ratio of whatever you're using as your source of nitrogen. And so you don't want to put very much of it, just like you don't want to put much sawdust in a compost pile.
Okay. How long should manure age until it's ready to go directly on the garden?
I would say a year as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And one more from the chat. Where do you store your scraps until you make the compost?
I just store them in my backyard. I have a place that's just it's a place out of the way that I just store them in. Some people like to store them in a bin. I just pile them up there. And then when I'm ready to make my compost pile, which will be nearby that, then I'm dragging from there, or not dragging, but putting them in my wheelbarrow and taking them to my compost pile and mixing them with the manure. But yes, as I said, you can also use the kind of bins that I showed to store if you're wanting it a little more neat and tidy than my backyard looks.
Okay, I have been dumping my chicken manure in a pile with a decent amount of pine shavings in it. Some of the pile has been there over a year. Should I start a new pile for my compost and just take a little at a time from the manure pile?
I would say if the chicken manure has been sitting there for a year, some of it is probably already composted and can go directly on your beds. So that's where you wouldn't want to keep adding fresh stuff. If the old stuff you could put directly on your garden bed, then I would start picking another pile that's your fresh stuff. It also depends on how wet your chicken manure got. If it just dried out, it may be still hot. So you may want to test it and add water to it and see if it starts to heat up, in which case you can use it for a fresh compost pile. And if it doesn't heat up, then it's ready for you to put in your garden.
Okay, perfect. Do you need to cover it when it rains to avoid getting it too wet?
The compost pile, as
I
I
think
said,
that's what they're referring to,
yeah.
yeah.
I don't, as I said, I let the rain on my compost pile. I don't have to water it then.
Mhm.
And I haven't, even here in Sandpoint, Idaho, where we have very wet winters, I've never gotten it too wet. The time and when I did want to cover up a compost pile was when I lived outside of Eugene, Oregon. It was so wet
Ah,
for the
yes.
winter, and it didn't ever freeze. And so I found then my pile got bogged down in water, and I covered it with a tarp.
Okay, good. Karen says, in my town, we're not allowed to have open compost areas. Would it be better for me to put my compostable items directly into the garden beds, trenching, or to use a compost tumbler?
You can also get some, I think they're often made out of plastic. They're compost bins, but they sit on the soil, but they have a lid to them. So that,
Mm.
or you could make a wooden lid for your, if you made a compost bin like the picture I showed that's out of wooden slats, You can put a lid over that, and I would hope that would be okay, but that's hard to work with if you can't. So yes, you could try trenching when then you're just burying it in the trench.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay. Somebody asked, where do you keep your food scraps?
the food scraps, as I said, most of them go to my chickens first. And then, but then other ones that I can toss, like my onion skins, the chickens won't eat. So I toss those in just the same place I'm tossing my rubbish from the garden, the old plants and the leaves and things like that. And then
Okay.
I just cover them with some of the dried leaves.
Okay. How do you feel about leaf mold compost?
That, I'm assuming that's just the compost that's made from the leaves that dry up, and that's wonderful stuff. Leaves are great. I collect all the leaves I can. In fact, some of the leaves from my neighbors when I make my compost, so that I have plenty of leaves in my compost. And I also use my dried leaves as mulch over my garden beds in the winter time, just to protect them.
Okay. Let me see. What about using ash in your compost or directly in your garden?
As I said,
I'm assuming wood
use it
ash.
sparingly. That's like the charcoal question. Ash and charcoal, you don't want too much of.
Okay. Would you advise against composting the shells from colorful Easter eggs?
Yes.
Okay.
Most of the dye in Easter eggs is somewhat toxic, unless you just dyed them with natural dyes.
Okay. All right. Brenda asked, and I'm not sure what she's referring to. It must have been something that you were saying. Is rabbit best?
Oh, rabbit
Maybe when
manure
the
best?
whole goat manure thing came up or something.
Rabbit is nice because you can actually add rabbit directly to your garden's bed. It doesn't have to be composted. So I have a friend that has a rabbit, and she'll give me her droppings, and I'll put them around my raspberry bushes and things like that. So yeah, rabbit doesn't have to go be composted to be used, the droppings of it.
Okay. And then I think you covered this, but I'm just gonna ask it again. You are collecting these materials over the course of a year. Are you keeping these piles wet so they don't get dry? Have the materials started breaking down already, and is that okay?
Some of them have started breaking down because they're going to get wet from the rain. Although here in Sandpoint, we have a very dry summer, so they don't necessarily get too wet. I don't water them, I just let them be. Some will start breaking down, which is great because then they already aren't quite as big and chunky for when I'm making compost, and it's easier for me to break them up into smaller pieces.
Okay. And then Jill, who asked the biochar, just information, she said biochar can be inoculated with microorganisms to feed the soil. So that's what she
Oh,
was using.
okay.
Okay, one of the last questions that I have, hold on, I'm going back and forth between two. We process chickens yearly. Are the feathers and innards okay to add to the compost pile?
If you're making a hot pile, that with, with manure or something that's really going to heat it up, I have put chicken feathers in. And I know farmers who can make big piles of compost from their manures can put the chicken parts in as well, and they will decompose. If you're in town, though, that's a little more risky because you're probably not going to have a big enough pile that's actually going to get hot enough to decompose animal parts.
I also found too, the animal parts in the country, you had to be careful of bringing in other animals
Right.
because they could smell
Coyotes.
it and they would dig it up and take it. Yeah, I didn't want that.
I did have one of my chickens died just before I was making my compost pile this winter, and I live in town now. And I just put the chicken carcass at the very bottom of the pile and then put everything over the top of it, and have had no problems with that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last question that I have, if you add fresh rabbit manure to the garden, does it need to be mixed in or just put it on top?
You can just put it on top.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Anybody else? Your last moment to ask any more questions of Julie. This has been great, Julie, and thank you for taking the time. It doesn't look like anybody else. You have sufficed everybody's curiosity
Oh,
with your
good.
knowledge. So thank you so much. And thank you, ladies, for being on here tonight. And those of our VIPs, this should be up and available to you in a week on YouTube. And those of you that are not, it'll be up after that. So, Julie, thank you again so much for being on here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yes, great information. All right. Good night, everybody, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you.